So before we go on, though, I'd like to ask Elisa to walk us through another poll. And my question to you is, which of these approaches has your company used? Have you used values only, principles only, behaviors only, or those behavior-based models only? Or have you used more than one of those, all of those, or none of those? So here are your options. So Lisa, how are we doing on that? I'm not sure, Lisa, are you on mute?
Yes, I was. We have a little bit of a hybrid approach here. So it looks like, right now it's like 5 is our winner, but we still have votes coming in. So, okay, here we go. I'm going to go ahead and share their poll with you. All right. So it looks like a number 5 with more than one of A and D. So a mix of the top 4 was the clear winner here. Okay, let me go ahead and end this.
Okay, very good. And actually, that's in my experience, pretty frequently companies have used more than one of these approaches, maybe not all of them. IBM is one of the companies that's used all of them. They're all great approaches, so I'm glad to know that most of you have used at least some of them, if not all of them. So let's talk about the concept that I really want to bring forward here. And it takes us back about 8 years to 2002 when IBM faced a really big challenge. And as Elisa said, we purchased PricewaterhouseCoopers Consulting. And what a lot of people know is that meant we were bringing in a lot of people, about 30,000 into IBM. But what a lot of people don't know is what IBM already had and the integration challenge that we faced. And that was that IBM already had about 30,000 management consultants. And we needed to somehow blend these two groups of people. So we had the two different sides. Many of the IBMers were coming from the industry. For instance, I had come from Ernst & Young and Deloitte Consulting. So we had all the different flavors of the management consulting industry here together, and we needed to somehow make 60,000 people a happy family operating in 160 countries. And the team, I was asked to lead this effort for the change in culture work, and the team that was given to me was a very experienced team. They had over 6 decades, all of us together, over 6 decades of experience working on culture in mergers and acquisitions. So we had a lot of experience, but we stood back from it and said, we don't have what we need. We needed to develop some new things. So we did that. So to make a very long story short, we came up with some new additions to the toolkit for working on culture. These things do not replace any of those great things that we just talked about. They're great approaches. And now we're adding some more things to give you and others more capabilities to work on your culture. The first one is the idea of business practices, which is a tangible surrogate for culture. And we'll definitely talk about that one today. And then the second one, which I think we're probably the most proud of because it's so simple, it's pretty amazing, and that is right versus right, which is both a concept and a technique for addressing certain types of conflicts, such as culture clash. And then outcome narrative, which are a structured storytelling technique. Now, we have time today to talk about business practices and right versus right, and we will talk about the way that we can use them as concepts or techniques for a specific situation, in this case for service excellence and developing a culture for that. But there are other ways that you can use the techniques. For instance, if you're facing mergers, acquisitions, if you're in alliances, et cetera, those 4 that are listed down there beside the word method are situations that I would emphatically tell you if you face these, you face culture challenges and you need to really work on them or else they will hurt you in some way. So let's talk a bit about business practices. And I like to describe business practices as the unseen hand that propels action within an organization. It's just the organization's habits, their collective habits for getting work done. And this stuff is rarely documented, and I like to say that it's more caught than taught. As a matter of fact, I joined IBM about 15 years ago, and the way that I went about trying to learn the IBM culture was to ask person that clearly knew a lot of folks, knew the company, was very experienced and very successful, I asked her to be my mentor. And I spent as much time as I could talking with her, asking her questions, getting her advice. And that was part of my main way of learning IBM. Now, these business practices, and we'll define them better in just a moment here, are an adequate surrogate for culture in a lot of situations. When a lot of business leaders are saying, I'm facing some sort of a culture challenge, it's this stuff that they're talking about. Now, as I give you some of these examples, just look at the pictures that are over there on the right-hand side and envision how these two different companies might do things either the same or differently. So some examples of business practices are, how should we make decisions around here? Now, I've worked at a lot of different clients that have described themselves as making consensus decisions. But I can tell you that not a single one of those companies did it the same way. Now I'll give you two examples. In one instance, there were actually three people. So they would get a lot of people involved, but there were really, at the end, three people that needed to agree on the decision, and then they would move forward. Okay? There was another example that there was really only one decision maker, but she liked to be very collaborative, and at the end, she would make the decision, but she wanted a lot of other people who had participated to get the buy-in. Now, what that means is there's a number of different behaviors that are actually underlying that overall business practice of consensus. Do you see how that works? The business practice is the collective side, the behaviors which are truly singular. We've tried to stretch them and make them collective, but they're really not. Behaviors are the individual actions that go underneath it, so they work together. Another example of business practice is, what do employees have latitude to do, and in what kind of circumstances? Again, just look at those two companies on the right-hand side and see how they might be different in your idea. Also, priority. We like to think about certain things that tend to conflict or compete with one another. Cost, schedule, quality, scope. Those things can, in some ways, when you look at various decisions that you need to make, conflict. I've worked at more than one situation where we had some people that were prioritizing cost and other people that were prioritizing schedule, and that was a conflict. Now, I'm getting a little ahead of myself. That's an example of a right versus right, and we'll talk more about that. And then another example is teamwork. So those were just a few examples of these many business practices, but the first question is, where do these things come from? And they're influenced by a lot of different things that are both internal and external to the company. So let's take a look at the internal one. You can see at the top there, leader preferences. Well, I'll use IBM as an example. Our top leader is Sam Palmisano. Now, in the last year, though, at IBM, I've heard people talk about Lou Gerstner. I've heard people talk about Watson. And these are both leaders that have been gone for, in one case, a very long period of time. So it's not just the leaders that are here. It's also those pivotal leaders that have left a real mark on the company. Another thing is the organization's history and certain kinds of pivotal events that have occurred. Again, to use IBM as an example, within the last year, I heard someone say about our near-death experience, which occurred in the early 90s, in 1993. I heard a senior executive say, we will do anything to make sure that we avoid doing that again. You know, and so it's clear that that leader is thinking about that on an active basis, making sure that we don't drop into the same set of traps. Also, our size. Compare a company like IBM with more than 400,000 people to your company, which might also be large or it might be quite small, right? Size influences things like the formality that you need to go through, or how much informality can you afford. The strategy of the company, the life cycle. You can see a lot of different things that impact from the inside, and there's things that influence from the outside as well. You can see the one that I'm sure that a number of you are thinking out that I would talk about at the very top there, national culture. Absolutely, it's got a huge impact, but there's also some other sides of it when you see, for instance, the national culture of the headquarters. Now, again, to use IBM as an example, in the last year I've had the opportunity to literally travel all over and meet with a number of different IBMers from places like Brazil and China and Slovakia and the Czech Republic. And let me tell you that IBMers are IBMers. Now, they have different flavors, clearly, when you go into those different countries, but we're still IBMers. Part of that is because of our strategy to be a globally integrated enterprise. You may operate in a lot of different countries and they may have a much stronger flavor of those countries, but in some cases the national culture of the headquarters does influence. Same thing if you've got key partners or key customers down there at the bottom, the national cultures or business practices for those others that are inside of your chain. Think about companies like Walmart and Toyota and how big of an influence they have on the companies on either side of them. And then also things like the history of the industry and what kind of industry is this. Compare healthcare, pharmaceutical to, for instance, certain types of manufacturing. Very different kinds of, even though they are in the pharmaceutical and the manufacturing, both manufacture something, they're going to manufacture it in a very different way. Part of that is because of government regulations and the other requirements, right? So think about pharmaceuticals versus a lot of kinds of manufacturing. But let me give you an example from a client that I worked with a number of years ago. They did heavy manufacturing, and so not necessarily one of the ones that you think would be heavily regulated, but they were highly regulated because they made nuclear generators for Navy submarines. Okay, so they were highly influenced by both the fact that they were in the nuclear field and had all of those requirements, as well as a very strong customer being the U.S. Navy, and they needed to be able to balance those. So they were very formal with a lot of things, more so than some of the other similar kind of manufacturing companies that I've done consulting with. And then also professions and occupations. In school is where we learn a lot of these business practices. That's also where our mindsets in many cases are set. And we're going to talk a bit about mindsets in a few minutes, but just think about how all of the things that are on this page can impact how you conceptualize and think about the business, what those mindsets are. Now, how do you find out what these business practices are? Because let me tell you, if you've been at your company for more than 5 years, a lot of this stuff you're on autopilot now. You're just kind of functioning because you just know these things, right? So with the right questions, you can surface these business practices and make them even more clear. And they tend to be how and who-oriented questions. And you can see some of the examples right here. So even though the second question, what decisions are made by leaders and which one by employees, that's really kind of a combination of a how and a who-oriented question, right? So if you ask these questions, you can understand things. These are 3 categories here. Decisions, processes, and priorities are some real common ones that we see that are important. Some of the other ones that we have listed in our book are, an accountability and how should relationships be handled and what should we do with policies and what about problem solving, et cetera. Those are just some of the categories, but if you think about it, just all the kinds of questions you need to ask are how and who. You don't necessarily need to have that full list.